this guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
Okay, so if I could first call on the Democracy Fund, JCCF, please.
Good evening, Minister.
Good evening.
I'm Hatem Kir, Counsel for the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. So right from the start of the pandemic, while people like you and I had the opportunity to work from home, truckers still had to go out and keep the goods moving, right?
Right.
And that's why they were originally designated as essential service providers, and they were exempted from the vaccine mandate, right?
So first of all, let me just say that truckers over the last 2 years have done an amazing job. Like you said, when many of us had the option of working from home, they kept the movement of goods going. Most of us never thought for a moment about how these products got to the shelves, but we certainly were reminded of the importance of the industry when everything else was shut down, yet the products kept on arriving. So I don't think we could say thank you enough to truckers for their professionalism and for their job. And to answer your question about how policies were developed throughout the pandemic, these were done based on the advice that we received from public health, and also taking into account considerations of the realities on the ground. And there have been several professions and several categories that were granted exemptions at the beginning of the pandemic.
And truckers were one of them?
Truckers were one of them.
Okay, and you note in your witness statement that the protests arose in response to the elimination of that designation, correct?
My understanding is that the protests rose to oppose all mandates, not just truckers' mandate.
But you state in your interview summary, which you adopted, it states that your understanding was that the protest arose in response to the elimination of that designation, right?
I think it was a trigger, but again, I am not here to speak on behalf of the protesters, but my understanding is that in every communication they issued, they opposed all vaccine mandates.
Okay, can we please pull up JCF 50191? And while that's being pulled up, just for the benefit of my friends, this is a compilation of documents that are listed individually in the database. I'll mention their IDs as we go through. I'm just using this to save a bit of time as we pull up documents. Minister, you can recognize that this is this appears to be a news release from the province of Alberta, correct?
This is the first time I'm seeing this document, and that's what the headline says.
Okay, and again, for the record, this is individually in the database as JCF 50192. Now, do you see the title where it says Alberta takes steps to safely return to normal? Correct?
Yes.
With the date of February 8th just above that?
Okay, yeah.
Okay, and if we go down to page 2, Mr. Clerk, Minister, do you see at the second paragraph, it says Alberta will remove all the restriction exemption program and capacity limits under 500, right?
Okay, that's what it says.
And then if we go to page 3, it sets out a schedule for other restrictions being lifted, right?
I mean, again, I have not seen this document before, and I'm only seeing what is being in front of me on the screen. So it says step 2, step 3. So I'm assuming that what you're saying is correct.
And you, I take it you were aware that this was happening at the time in February, at least in the broad strokes?
Yeah, I mean, again, as I said, all governments, not just in Canada, provincial, municipal, around the world, had different public health measures, including mandates, and all governments had their own plan of how to adjust these measures.
Okay, and then if we go to page 7 in this document, which for the record is in the database as JCF 50193. This is a Manitoba news release dated February 11th, right?
It appears that way.
And the title says that Manitoba accelerating plan to reduce public health restrictions based on improving COVID-19 situation.
That's what the headline says.
And again, were you aware of Manitoba's action at the time?
Again, I was aware that different governments had their own plan of adjusting their public health measures. So did we.
Well, you might start to notice a pattern I'm getting at, but perhaps we can go to page 9 in this document, Mr. Clerk, which for the record is JCF 50190. We see an Ontario announcement dated February 14th, right?
Yeah.
And it announces that Ontario is moving to its next phase of reopening on the 17th.
Okay.
And just for the sake of completion, lastly, if we just go to page 14, which for the record is JCF 50194, this is a Saskatchewan news release titled Living with COVID, Proof of Vaccination No Longer Required, Business Verifier app discontinued, correct?
That's what the headline says.
Okay, so you said you were aware that different jurisdictions were taking their own responses. What I'd suggest to you is that given the timing of these measures all being taken by the different provinces, that they were being taken as a step by the provinces to respond to the concerns of protesters. Would you agree with that?
No? Is that what you think?
I'm suggesting that to you.
No, well, I don't think so. But at the end of the day, it's up to the government. The government, none of these governments have shared with me their rationale. I'm assuming that just like they impose these measures based on their advice that they received, I'm assuming they're adjusting their measures based on the advice that they receive and their own considerations.
Well, we heard yesterday that at the first ministers' meeting relating to the invocation of the Emergencies Act, that Premier Kenney asked the federal government to lift the vaccine mandate as it applied to truckers crossing the border. And he mentioned that he had raised that previously. I don't believe you were at that meeting, but were you aware of his opinion?
I was not at that meeting. I think he had made it public. I just can't remember when he made it public, his opposition to border truckers crossing the borders mandate.
Well, we also saw a text from Premier Kenney, which was forwarded to you by Minister LeBlanc, where Premier Kenney called the trucker vaccine mandate, quote, dumb political theater, end quote. Do you remember receiving that?
I do.
So again, given these comments from Premier Kenney and the timing of the provinces, you still maintain that none of this was in response to the protests?
Again, you'll have to ask the provinces that question. I'm not in a position to offer justification for a provincial government's decision.
Well, given the motivation of the protesters, did the government consider resuming the exemption for truckers?
And by the way, let me just clarify, and again, it's not up to me to talk about provincial governments' decisions, but they did not. Most governments, provincial governments, did not lift all mandates. So just for the record. Second, we don't make public policy based on the number of protesters or emails that we get. We make public policy, particularly during the pandemic, and let me be the first to acknowledge, governments around the world, including the federal government, did extraordinary measures in what we believed was the right thing to protect the health and safety of Canadians. I never imagined provinces shutting down businesses. I never imagined provinces invoking curfews. I never imagined the federal government putting limitation on travel. But we all did that. Governments across Canada did these measures because we believed we are saving lives. And yes, they were extraordinary, but I could tell you, no one, at least us, I'm not making any apology for doing what we believed the best thing for protecting lives. Now, of course, it caused inconvenience. Of course, it caused disruption, and our government did whatever we can to mitigate those disruptions. And Canadians understood that. Canadians understood that. So back to your question, our policies were based on the advice and facts and the science that we receive, not based on polls or number of protesters or even the illegal activities that should never drive public policy.
So the government should never change its policies in response to outcry from protesters?
I'm saying governments, especially during pandemic, made tough decisions based on what we believed was the best for the protection of the health and safety of Canadians. Now, if you're asking me, should government change its policy because people break the law in expressing their opposition, I'd say no. Should the government listen to public and consider the sentiment of public? Of course. But we are guided by the interest of Canadian, protecting the interest of Canadians. So being aware of the sentiment of Canadian is different than advancing the interest of Canadians. Sometimes they're connected. Sometimes the sentiment might be different depending on the groups and the information that they have or the priorities that they have.
I'm going to suggest to you that the government couldn't reconsider its removal of that exemption because it had already labeled the truckers and the protesters as white supremacists and now had to maintain its opposition to anything associated with the protest.
Yeah, no, I don't agree with you. First of all, truckers themselves, if you followed the press releases by the Canadian Trucking Association, by Teamsters, the unions that represent many truck drivers, have distanced themselves from these illegal blockades and occupations. They said they're giving the industry a bad name. They do not represent the industry. So I've had several meetings with representatives of trucking associations, of trucking companies, and they all felt that they're giving the trucking industry a bad name. Second, let me just highlight a second point, by the way. We actually eased our international travel measures, and I can't remember exact date, but sometime in February, where there was a requirement for upon arrival testing. Those tests were eliminated. And that wasn't because of the illegal occupation. It was because we entered a different phase of the pandemic, and we felt, based on the advice that we got, we could adjust and ease our measures. So we did that.
And one of the other things that the government did was invoke the Emergencies Act to deal with the protest, right?
Say that again?
One of the other things done in February was, of course, the invocation of the Emergencies Act while we're here.
That is correct.
And I understand that the invocation of the Emergencies Act was not intended to infringe upon anyone's charter rights, correct?
It was specifically stated in the provisions of the Act.
And so first of all, I understand that the cabinet then would have turned its collective mind to that when discussing the invocation.
We considered
Sorry,
all.
as far as you're asking what cabinet deliberated, that's protected by cabinet confidence.
Okay, fair enough. Suffice it to say, cabinet's intention was to protect the charter rights of Canadians.
That's our Constitution, and we're all sworn to uphold our Constitution.
Do you believe cabinet protected the charter rights of tow truck drivers? We kept in mind the charter rights of all Canadians, including truck drivers. You'd agree that tow truck drivers weren't protesters themselves, aside from perhaps individual cases?
I don't understand the question.
Well, so you said in your interview summary that some tow truck drivers refused to tow trucks out of sympathy with the protests, right?
I said that, yes, there was a reluctance for a variety of reasons, One of the reasons may be because they might be sympathetic, but the bigger reasons that we heard is that they were afraid for their livelihood and their safety.
Well, I want to focus on the group that was objecting out of sympathy with the protest. You'd agree that they may have done so out of political or moral reasons?
I can't really speak on their behalf.
You'd agree that the emergency measures regulation compelled tow truck drivers to serve a cause that was potentially contrary to their beliefs if they were refusing out of sympathy with the protest?
You know, again, the Emergencies Act was necessary given the circumstances. The tools within the Emergencies Act were necessary to end illegal activities, including blockades and occupation. And in order for us to de-escalate the situation and to end these illegal activities, we needed access to tow trucks, making sure that tow truck drivers were compensated and made whole. And I'm pretty sure that, I can't speak about the selection of tow truck drivers and tow truck companies, how the law enforcement agencies in choosing them. So I'm sure they found those who were willing as long as they felt they were compensated and protected.
Minister, I'm out of time, but I'm just gonna push back on that one answer you gave me, because I asked you if tow truck drivers who would have refused out of sympathy with the protest, as you highlighted in your interview statement, would have been compelled by the emergency measure regulations to serve a cause that they did not agree with, and you responded by talking about the necessity of it. But I'm asking you, were those people compelled to serve a cause that they felt went against their conscience and their choice of association?
So I answered the question by saying I was not involved in how tow truck drivers or tow truck companies were selected. I would like to think that there were options to select tow truck drivers who were willing to participate.
You'd like to think that, but certainly the power created that opportunity, right?
I was not involved in the selection of tow truck drivers.
Okay, I have no further questions. Thank you.